Good evening from Armenia. My name is Nicola Stanisch, and I'm the Executive Director of the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative. And it's my pleasure to be the moderator of today's discussion. I want to start by saying thank you to everyone joining us from all the corners of the world. I want to thank Future Studio Discussion Platform for hosting this event. Today is actually our first Aurora Dialogues online event. After 4 years of numerous physical Aurora Dialogues that we held around the world. And today, in good Aurora Dialogues tradition, we will have a chance to take on humanity's crucial issues together with some of the world's most respected humanitarian experts. But before we start, let me just quickly remind you that we offer both Armenian and Russian simultaneous translation on Zoom. So if you are on Zoom, you can choose under the interpretation menu the Portuguese channel for Armenian and the Russian channel for Russian. Also, I would like to remind all our participants that you are welcome and we are happy to receive your questions from now onwards, also during Q&A. And the speakers will try to answer the most urgent ones or the most frequently asked questions. And now it's my big pleasure to introduce our tonight's panelists. And I want to start with Sunita Krishnan, who's joining us from India. Sunita is the founder of Prajwala, and she is one of the 3 2018 Aurora Prize humanitarians. We have Comfort Ero joining us from Kenya. She's the program director of the Crisis Group Africa, and she is also a member of the Aurora Prize expert panel. Andrew Hudson is joining us from the US. He's the executive director of Crisis Action and Aurora Prize expert panel member as well. And lastly, we have Sebastian Juenemann, and CEO of CADUS NGO, and as well an Aurora Prize expert panel member. Welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. We all are affected by this COVID-19 pandemic. This very specific time, it is very important to keep in mind that there are vulnerable groups in the world, all over the world, that are actually affected by other humanitarian emergencies, such as conflicts, disasters, maybe climate change. And on top of that now, of the pandemic. And that put them in a hugely precarious situation. And that is why we from Aurora today, we want to shine a light on some selfless individuals that are actually operating in the current situation. And we want to see what obstacles they are facing. And of course, also how is the situation in their environment? And most of all, where do they find the strength to continue to do what they are doing? And since the 4 of you represent 4 different continents and of course very different countries as well. For me personally, it would be, to begin with, very interesting to hear from you as humanitarians. Firstly, how is the situation in the community where you are operating, and how did the pandemic affect your organization? So what obstacles were you facing? And I mean obstacles that really hurt and that really affect your work. And I would like to start with you, Comfort, to share maybe your experience as a prominent leader overseeing the work of local teams and also promoting peace during this very special pandemic time. Comfort.
Hello? Hello? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, it's good. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And just to say, the headquarters of Crisis Group Africa program is based in Kenya, and thank you for mentioning that. But I myself, currently, I'm in London, and came home after making sure other staff in our headquarters were fine. But thank you very much to Aurora for inviting me to speak on these issues, and it's a pleasure to be with all your friends and allies. In terms of the questions that you asked me to address, I mean, obviously the biggest challenge for Crisis Group, given our own mandate, which is very much focused on deadly violent conflict, was making sure that we could continue to report and, you know, shine a spotlight on what the pandemic meant and what the impact of this global public health crisis meant on communities, very vulnerable communities that were already facing an onslaught of other problems, especially those that were in conflict zones and those who are in societies that face political repression, and countries that are either emerging from conflict or those that showed signs of deterioration. So that has been a major preoccupation for Crisis Group. But ensuring that we could do that work, ensuring that we could maintain 100% focus on that, meant that we had to make sure that we were able to safeguard and our staff all over the world. Within the Africa program specifically, we had staff located throughout West Africa, in Central Africa region, in Southern Africa region, in the Horn of Africa region as well. So these are all our localities. So making sure that our staff were either safe where they were, had access to good healthcare provisions, or we were able to get them to go back to their own homes and be with their families. Some unfortunately couldn't leave because, as you know, a number of countries shut down their borders. A number of countries closed down their airspace. And a number of our colleagues also chose to stay in those countries that they operate on. And a number of them have their families there as well. So different measures were put in place. What I would say that was very reassuring was the way in which colleagues were very quick to adapt to the situation, going online very quickly and working online and getting engaged in conversations like we're having today, trying to rethink how we do our field work without putting our staff at risk or other networks that we rely on in those countries at risk, and being able to continue to advocate key messages with other key partners, so Crisis Action. And two examples where we worked with Crisis Action, for example, was on the question of the Sahel and also the question of the arms embargo for South Sudan as well. And being able to advocate to all the key players in a crisis was crucial, but also being aware of the environment in which we were working in and recognizing the conditions of a number of our local staff, but also the environment in which we are working in, and recognizing that the suffering that a number of other people in those countries were experiencing. So it's been both internal, looking after the well-being of our staff, making sure that we remain faithful to our mandate, to be able to address, you know, the core constituency that we are concerned with, i.e. vulnerable groups, but also paying attention to the regions and in the countries that all our colleagues are operating in as well. So the leadership has been very clear about what needed to be done, both internally and externally towards crisis groups, international, regional and local partners as well. I can stop there, and you know, there may be other questions, observations that emerge from the conversations, but thank you very much for asking me.
Yeah, Comfort, thank you very much for this kind of introductory picture that you give us. Maybe I just go to Sebastian from a different angle, a different region. CADUS, what is your experience? What were the main obstacles that you were facing?
The main obstacles obstacles for us. We are working in northeast Syria at the moment. We're operating a field hospital there in a huge refugee camp with more than 65,000 inhabitants. And the biggest challenges at the moment is the absence of all the essential equipment and materials we normally need, like protection equipment, because of the travel and the economic interruptions to get them in this area, not even through the WHO. And the complete absence of, for example, more complicated diagnosis and laboratories is a big challenge as well. So in northeast Syria, we are a little bit like blindfolded in terms of we can only diagnose COVID-19 through the different symptoms and not really like identify it through laboratories and stuff. And another big challenge for sure is that the countries close down the borders. That means that we can't get our international staff that should be there right now into the country. That means that some people had to stay much longer than they expected to stay, which for sure is a huge problem and a huge impact on the persons themselves. And then as well, that the international response at the moment is really not functioning because every country has the same problem. This is a huge impact on our work as well. Normally in such a crisis or with an epidemic event, you will have some countries who are not affected and can send their teams and their support, their supplies. And at the moment, it's really, really difficult. We have an emergency response team ready, waiting to go somewhere, but it's really the travel restrictions, supplies restrictions, the economic restrictions are a problem that we never faced before.
Can I quickly ask back, you said no test kits and no laboratories, whatever. There is no official statistic in Syria about COVID?
In Syria, perhaps, but you still have the civil war in Syria, and we are in a region where you have like a self-organized structure, so the Kurdish authorities and the northeast people who are living there, and there you don't have these lab capacities like in other countries, like in Germany, where you can test thousands of people a day. So the official statistics are mainly based on symptoms as well, and not on laboratory diagnostics.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. That sounds quite difficult, actually, the situation. I would go on with a related question because a lot of organizations had actually to shut down. We all know that. They had to stop their activities, close maybe centers, whatever. But then also some have found other creative ways to be useful and to kind of contribute to the community with some tools against isolation or volunteer services or whatever. And just to turn it a bit and also talk about the opportunities that we all know are also in this crisis. I would actually like to ask about, let's say, the biggest lessons so far learned, and maybe in the context of the community. Sunita, if you would like to give us a picture how the situation is and what maybe your biggest lesson has been during the last few weeks and months.
Good evening, namaste from India. The COVID pandemic, for us, the lockdown started on 18th of March, and with lockdown came all the borders within the country getting closed. So we have around 30 states, and every state became one standalone state. Within the state, every district became standalone. So district boundaries were closed, state boundaries were closed, which brought in a huge amount of economic devastation. But which I think the governments understood that there's going to be economic devastation, but what they did not calculate and what none of us calculated was the entire sense of fear that would enter the space of, the daily wagers and the daily laborers. And over 15 million migrant labor went into a total panic mode, and they started fleeing back to their hometowns, walking thousands of miles with their little babies, pregnant women, old people, just somehow to reach their hometown so that they can die in their hometowns and not die in the city where they were working. That was one of the biggest, the exodus of migrant labor was one of the biggest human tragedies that we saw on our streets every day. The public health system in my state is very weak. People all depend on the corporate hospitals. The government took a decision that all the COVID patients will be treated only in the government hospital. And suddenly the entire public health system was collapsing. The frontliners were all getting infected. The police were getting infected. The doctors were getting infected. The nurses were getting infected. So now there are no beds, there's no space, and there are no doctors to treat. So that's another big tragedy that is unfolding. For us, it became far more challenging because we did not have the privilege to close down our operations. We have 5 large safe shelters for girls rescued from trafficking, sex trafficking specifically. We couldn't just abandon them. So we have more than 600 residents. We had to feed them in a situation where everything is locked down outside, and the funding became a huge challenge. Donations became a big challenge. And at one end, we had to feed so many thousands of mouths and keep the morale high. We also had to bring the staff to stay inside the safe spaces only and not come from their homes because it was too risky. So, somehow doing that, many came, many did not come because the family pressure was so high. But at the same time, the external tragedies that was unfolding around us, we couldn't go blind on that. So the organization also had to respond to what is happening outside. So we got into relief work, feeding thousands of mouths every day on the streets, people who were walking back because they were starving. Or, there was a whole world of invisible citizens who do not have their civic identity. They don't have an identity card to access any government support, like the transgenders, like women in prostitution. These are communities which are hidden. So they were really, really, nowhere. So we have to ensure that groceries reach them and things like that. So we as an organization had, as a management, we had to, and for me personally, it was a huge challenge to ensure that the morale of my team was high, because we had to do internally our work and also externally go onto the street and risk getting infected, because we also became frontliners, and ensure that people got their relief on time. So it's been amazingly challenging, but I think one of the greatest lessons for us was the way the survivors who are in our residence, reacted in this whole crisis. While we were actually getting depleted and our energies were going down, they kind of stood up and they said, we seem to be the only person safe in the world, cocooned in safe houses where we are fed properly. We want to give back. And they started actually stitching thousands of reusable masks, face masks for frontliners. And in a matter of 15 days, they stitched around 35,000 face masks, which they donated it to the frontliners. So those kind of extraordinary things we were able to witness. I'm sure others in the panel also must have seen such extraordinary gestures of humanity, because as big the tragedy was, also that big the humanity stood. So it was like every good person in this community kind of conspired that nobody will go hungry, nobody will, will on the street will die. So I think we experienced the goodness of humanity much more in this COVID crisis than ever before.
Yeah, we touch on that a bit later, but it's great to hear that, of course. Just a quick question. Did you manage then to keep the virus out of your shelters?
yes, we ensured that all our safe shelters were safe from the virus. Huge safety protocols and security protocols were introduced. We were forced to set up a quarantine unit because unfortunately, the poor became more vulnerable, poor became more desperate. So there were people who sold their daughters during this crisis just to survive. And because of which we had to do rescue operations. And doing a rescue operation in this kind of a situation meant we could get infected anywhere, going and holding somebody outside and things like that. And to maintain the physical distance and the social distancing and all the rest of it in a rescue operation is not so easy. So we were forced to set up a quarantine facility in our shelter. We were forced to learn new skills. Also, we had, we are a grassroots organization. We're not, computer savvy, and we're not technology savvy. So, 50% of my staff are like hardcore grassroots workers. They don't know how to email, or they don't know what is Skype or Zoom or anything like that. So, while 50% of the staff stayed home, we didn't know how to engage them. And but then that also became an opportunity to teach them small skills, like how do you make your Facebook page, what is Zoom, what is Skype. So yes, we are by the way, Nicola, let me also tell you, I was one of the first COVID suspects in my state. And I was admitted in the government hospital as a COVID suspect. Okay. So I was the first suspect in my state. And I was on the 2nd of March, I was in the government hospital. And so I had a clearer picture of what it means to be in a government hospital. I don't know how the situation is there in Kenya and in Syria, but in India, government hospital is meant only for the poor and the most deprived. The people who have something do not go there because it is horrendous. But I was there, so so my people, I think, got a little time to prepare themselves for COVID, because from the 2nd of March to 16th of March, before the lockdown was announced, my entire team went into the crisis mode that the founder could be COVID positive.
Yeah,
because I was myself.
Yeah, that is of course a crisis within the crisis. Yeah. Okay, let me turn to Andrew. Same question, maybe lesson learned, and maybe also about the major situation around in your environment where you're active.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. I mean, I think the biggest lesson for me as a CEO of an organization with about 50 people in 12 countries, the biggest lesson has been around leadership. And I think in a crisis, people really want honest leadership. They want vulnerability. They want transparency. And they want emotional connection. And so, we've been, as an organization, spending a lot of time talking, as Comfort mentioned, about the well-being of our staff, the well-being of our teams, right? Everyone has been extremely stressed, extremely anxious. And I think, for me, what I've learned is that good leadership like that, it looks like being vulnerable, saying, I'm scared. I'm in New York City with 3 young children. I hear and understand and empathize with your fear. And asking how people are doing. How are you feeling? What can we do? And of course, in this country, it's not just been kind of a pandemic crisis, but it's then also been the racism crisis on top of that, which is leaving, a lot of people feeling very, very uneasy. So I think that's probably been the biggest lesson that I've learned, is around leadership and the importance of well-being. And I really feel like that this is one of, I hope, the positives that come out of the pandemic. Is I think that there is a greater recognition now that in the non-profit sector, that is expected, right? That we must put the well-being of our staff first, that we must have progressive and 21st century leadership where leaders are human beings and vulnerable and honest with their staff. So, you know, I think there's sort of two things. One thing I did also just want to mention, if we're looking for a sort of some sort of hope, has been Crisis Action has coordinated this work around a global ceasefire. We worked with Crisis Group and others around that. And you know, we have seen about 24 different warring parties and 11 different war zones commit to lay down their weapons. And of course, there are varying degrees of compliance with that. But I think what we have seen around the world in different conflicts is that the pandemic has given us an opportunity to try and stop some of these conflicts and get some ceasefires in some conflicts. So I think there is some good news there.
You muted, Andrew? Was that?
Glad you said that, Andrew. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Comfort, you want to add something on that?
No, I'm glad that Andrew picked up on that. I'm glad that Andrew picked up on that point.
Yeah. Because
the Secretary General, you know, made a global appeal in the name of you know, humanitarianism and also to deal with this global health crisis. And at least on the African continent, we can cite 3 or 4 cases. I mean, I'd like to add to what Andrew said, because he's right that it was an opportunity, and we've seen varying degrees of that ceasefire. But so that's a good news. I think Andrew will agree with me that what was disheartening, though not surprising, was the inability of the Security Council to reach consensus on supporting the SG's call for a global ceasefire. And that speaks also to the division that currently exists in the Security Council. It was there before we came into the pandemic. It has been exacerbated by the pandemic, and we will come out of the pandemic with an even more divided Security Council. You know, one of the things that we did at Crisis Group, as the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, we came out with a statement looking at the impact of the pandemic on peace and security, because that's our mandate. And we said that there were 7 trends to watch. And one of the trends that we were particularly concerned about was whether the pandemic would either help bring together or further damage multilateralism. And I think one of the key concerns that we have today is what is happening to multilateralism at a crucial time when international cooperation is required to help deal with this global public health crisis, but tied to it, the humanitarian and economic fallout that will derive from it as well. And you'll recall that the executive director of the World Health Organization warned that by the end of this year, we could face another pandemic, a food security pandemic as well. And the fact that the Security Council has been at loggerhead, particularly the US and China, has made it very difficult to reach consensus on a number of big issues that will be critical to helping to deal in a coherent manner with the crisis, and that also making the work of humanitarian agencies like our colleagues online here even more difficult. So I just wanted to attach myself to what Andrew said, both the opportunities, but some of the geopolitical ramifications for the lack of cooperation that we're seeing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Sunita, please.
She's on mute. She's on mute.
You have to, Sunita, we cannot hear you. You have to unmute.
Sorry. I just want to add something from the grassroots and from the groundwork that we do, that one of the very disheartening understandings during this entire phase and even now is how the poor and the disadvantaged do not matter in any planning. So when a country as a whole, a decision is taken for the whole nation, the poor are nowhere in the picture. So the more disadvantaged you are, the most vulnerable you are, most unheard you are, and you may be the majority, but you are a minority in terms of, you know, national planning or international planning, and that really bothers, because it's huge number of migrant laborers who in different parts of the world, in Dubai and in Gulf countries, stranded. They've lost their jobs. It's very not even any humanitarian intervention to bring them back to the countries, with everybody wanting COVID-free persons coming back, you know. So all kinds of new conditions are put, not for the rich. It is the poor and the most disadvantaged who bear the disproportionate burden of this whole thing. And that seems to be not anybody's priority. And that is very that's very painful, and that the poor continue to be there without a voice worries the hell out of me.
Thank you, Sunita. Now this draws, of course, a kind of a dark picture, although Sunita also mentioned the partly positive surprises, let's say, and I just wanted to go back to that as well, because we all have felt that also these very specific times. Now, I'm not talking about the most, the poorest, as Sunita just described, and underprivileged, but in our communities, this unity, or even as the ceasefire that you said, the situation where some conflicts really were put aside and people united in the fight against the pandemic. I would just like to address Sebastian, because you sounded from the description of the situation that was almost like the most, let's say, maybe desperate situation in the areas that you are active. Is there any good thing that you can see that is coming out for the people where you are active?
Regarding our project is a really difficult question. I would say what positive thing, or the good thing that we're seeing coming out mostly is to see how stable are the structures even without us. Like our aim is always, especially in the humanitarian aid, to make ourselves not necessary anymore. So we always try to enable local people, local groups, local structures to help themselves. So it was really wonderful to see how restless our colleagues on ground, our Syrian colleagues, are working day and night to fight COVID-19, even though we can't help them at the moment with a lot of equipment and material. On the other hand, it is a dark picture, and for me it stays a little bit a dark picture, because I can't see at the moment really how the situation is going better with, for example, the people work together, stuff like that. Just before the epidemic, the UN resolution for cross-border aid between Iraq and Syria was cancelled. Like the colleagues spoke before about the UN resolution that was not solved and not going on, stuff like that. The international networks are not working at the moment. The WHO is trying to do their best, but at least all the international rescue systems and aid systems are not working, and I can't see at the moment a really, I don't know, a really logical process to see where the gaps are and where the mistakes are in these concepts and in these big networks. At the moment, I see only that the people are like yeah, a little bit like the rabbit in front of the snake, and waiting to let this pandemic be over somehow, and then like went on like they did before. And I think this, yeah, unfortunately, I can't draw a brighter picture at the moment.
I mean, if I could just come in on Syria just briefly. I mean, Syria is one of the countries that we work on as well, more at the macro level, not at the at that level of a field hospital. But it's always hard to make generalizations. But I do, and I'm always a glass half full sort of person. But I think the ceasefires in Syria have largely held over the last few months. And I think, you know, the pandemic is part of that. It's certainly, you know, if we look at the extreme violence, an uptick in violence in the northeast of Syria earlier this year and the northwest of Syria, around Idlib and Turkey's incursion into Syria, you know, both of which, I mean, saw a million people on the move in a matter of a couple of weeks. You know, that is not the situation at the moment. I think that the ceasefire is largely holding. Of course, people would disagree with me, but I guess just the point I'm trying to make is I think levels of violence have decreased in Syria, and that the pandemic has probably got something to do with that. That was the only point I wanted to make.
Thank you, Andrew, for adding that. Yeah, let me come to a totally different point maybe after we have had or received an overview from your side of the challenges that you're facing. I guess most of you or all of you are aware that Aurora Humanitarian Initiative is based on a kind of a universal concept of gratitude. That we think everybody can relate to. So we express this in a kind of a transition. So you have survivors, of course, that comes from the Armenian history, second chance of life, then a revival, and then a thriving, hopefully. And with this thriving, there is this kind of urge of giving back something. And we very much believe in this, what we call the gratitude in action. And that is, of course, what all of Aurora is about. And actually, I just wanted to ask you how you relate to it. And I would like to start with Sunita, because you were actually mentioning it, the gratitude and to give back something. So how can you relate in your work on that, on that principle?
I think, Nicola, this was the most, I would say, golden period where we saw the miracle of gratitude in action every day in our lives. You know, there was no international aid, there was no big funding coming from anywhere, but very, very common people stood up and said, nobody will go hungry. And thousands of them cooked food so that the migrant labor, the people who were exoding, there was this exodus of labor, they were fed on the streets, water, food packets. There were so many thousands who shared what groceries they had, so that people who lost their livelihood, and millions lost their livelihood, because all the daily wagers who work completely lost their livelihood for 78 days. People stood up that way. I think if one would want to see, you know, I would call it God experience. You know, you experience God in the beauty of humanity around you. Everybody was so grateful for the one meal that they're having, that they could share that half a meal to somebody who's not having it. And that is something I was able to witness every day, because, you know, as a humanitarian leader myself, one always took pride that one did it. But when you saw a whole world of fellow human beings also doing the same, it becomes a cocoon of goodness that envelops you. And not only among the citizens who were, you know, who had jobs, who did this, I saw it among the victims who have no reason to give back, in my opinion, because they have been betrayed, they have been excluded, they have been, they are the ones who have had the rawest deal from this world. But they also stood up and said, if we are safe today, we want to give back to the world. and we want to do something for that. So I think the beauty of this goodness, I think actually kind of camouflaged the flaws in the system. We have a public, crumbling public health system, but the doctors did not give up. Not a single doctor, stopped treating a COVID patient. They were getting infected. They continued to treat COVID patients. So I think the external environment and more than the government, it is a civil society which stood up in this pandemic and saw that their fellow citizens did not starve. We are not still out of it. As a country, the lockdown is eased out, but the economy is nowhere near recovery. And maybe, I don't know whether it will recover at all, because the cases of COVID is just increasing. All of us are depleted. Resources, energy, every way we are depleted. There is a fear that any of us could be in danger. But still, the depletion of our heart is not happening. I continue to get calls, madam, where do you want us to give more provisions? Or where do you want us to go and give some wood? Do tell us, we have arranged for this much. And I think that's the most beautiful part. I have not seen this in my last 30 years of doing what I'm doing, what I've seen in the last 3 months.
Fantastic. Comfort, would you like to share your thoughts on that gratitude in action in the relation of your work?
Yeah, I mean, it's been, thanks for asking, these are deeply personal questions as well. It has been, going back to what, picking up some of the themes that Andrew mentioned about empathy and well-being, it's been gratifying watching our colleagues who sense gratitude that they're able to continue working, because we're hearing about a number of people who are not able to continue working. My colleagues, being very conscious of the environment in which they're working in, and seeing, to go back to the concerns that were raised around poverty and around a number of vulnerable people and a number of people who are suffering as a result. My colleagues have been sending out messages about initiatives that can be supported in their communities to help those more vulnerable people, or those that they know that have been hit immediately by the COVID. One of the biggest challenges certainly in the African continent, and I'm sure it's true for the Indian subcontinent as well, is that a large degree of the economic sector is informal. And a high percentage of those, at least on the Africa continent, that are working in the informal sector are women. So one of the concerns that we've had has been, how to support watching colleagues individually on the personal level, trying to notify each other and say, look, can you support this commune? Can you support this initiative? Do you know others who can help this community, these various sectors? So that's been quite gratifying to watch. The other thing that I again personally that I've watched is how staff are now trying to balance their home work life. There's no separation now today between life at home and life of work, because it's all happening in the same place. And I've got colleagues who've got 3 children. Andrew, congratulations, just talked about a newborn baby, and yet the question is how you can continue to do your work, give time to your family, and respond to all the various needs, even though leadership talks about well-being and empathy and making sure that everybody is fine. There's a sense in which you feel that you've got to continue working because you have to respond in this very vital moment to very vulnerable populations as well. So I wanted to raise that. And one lesson I think that is worth learning, to go back to your earlier question, and that speaks about gratitude, is the importance of communities, and never underestimating the power of communities. We tend to rely very much on an elite core, official people, on organizations to do certain things, and yet communities themselves, very close to the grassroots, see the problem and are able to respond very quickly to all the initiatives as well. And I think watching how they responded, they for me were the first respondents. For example, in the last epidemic that the African continent had, i.e. Ebola crisis, and they remain the first respondents, for example, in this global health pandemic as well. And I think showing gratitude towards them at the grassroots, at the rural areas, I think is something that we can all do as humanitarians more and more, and to recognize that partnering with communities and understanding their understanding of the effects of on local populations becomes important in our own advocacy, especially if we're speaking in the name of humanitarianism as well. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. I look at the watch. We are actually going into a short Q&A. If you're okay, we have received a few questions from the audience. And actually there is a perfect one for you, Andrew, because I just noted down because I'm so curious myself. You said it is important, you talked about leadership, right? To keep the emotional connection, and having dealt with Zoom for the last few months myself, I think that question goes in that direction. How actually do you manage to get people and motivated, or get your staff stay motivated during the crisis and remotely? How did you do it, this emotional connection?
Yeah, well, I guess we have an advantage because we are a remote organization anyway. As I said, we're about 50 people in 12 different countries. So part of this pandemic for me has been, there's some joy in watching everyone else now discover Zoom and back-to-back Zoom calls, which have been the bane of my existence for many years. But so I think as an organization, we've had quite a bit of experience with that. I think emotional connection, it's just the same whether you're on video or face to face. It's about asking the same questions to people. How are you feeling? That simple question, how are you feeling? Asking people questions, giving them the space. We as an organization, excuse me, 1 second, I have a I'm so sorry, this is the problem of having 3 children. This is also, though, how you build emotional connectivity, right? We're all human beings, we're all in this together.
No problem, yeah.
And I think, that has been a lesson that I've learned. So yeah, sharing how I've been feeling with our team, I think that builds emotional connection. And so, you can do all of those things via video conference. The only thing you can't do via video conference is touch someone, right, physically, but you can touch them emotionally. So I think you can build that emotional connectivity. We've tried to ensure that we have more Zoom calls with all of our team, so that we're helping to bring people together. We've had specific conversations on how people are feeling and how they're doing in response to the pandemic. So you can have specific curated conversations that really look at trying to build that emotional connection between teams. And just one other thing I wanted to say, which is relevant, I think, around what we're grateful for. And what we've seen is just a huge upswing in people wanting to collaborate and come together. And that's kind of the DNA of what crisis action does. We build coalitions and we build networks. And we saw on this global ceasefire initiative, within 48 hours, we had hundreds of NGOs come together from around the world on a call. And so I think what we're seeing, what I'm really grateful for is that, there's a recognition now, I think, of collective action, collaborating is needed more now than ever. And, that makes me feel quite good.
It's true. Oh.
I'm not sure whether we lost Sebastian, but let's skip that question. I don't know, anybody wants to comment on this, the emotional? I would say not all of people would probably agree with you, Andrew. This, the only thing missing is the physics. I personally, I really think it's such a difference, you know, to be, you know, physically together. But yeah, of course, if you're used to it, it's a different thing. Yes, Comfort, please.
No,
I think Sunita wanted to.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Comfort, you can finish. I'll speak after you.
No, I wanted to back what Andrew says, because when you work virtually and when you work in, you know, when your staff is dispersed around the world, then these online platforms become standard practice. Having to do it 24 hours a day, however, is a culture shock, Andrew. so there I have to agree with Nicola that it is a culture shock. But I want to reaffirm what you said about, you know, showing emotional well-being. You know, there was a time when to do that was not, people would think, oh, that's just too fluffy. But now I think it's more important, and being able to, we have, Nicola, we have things like virtual tea breaks, where we talk about anything but work, and if somebody wants to talk about work, they're entitled to talk about work. But it's the idea is that this is an informal platform where we just want to come together as colleagues, and you can talk about anything you want. But it's the idea that, again, to go to what Andrew was saying, the need to connect to people's humanity, and to let them know that when I say to you this time, how are you? It's really is about how are you, and I want to know how you're coping and how you're transitioning and how you're getting on well. So I'm glad that Andrew said that. I wanted to back that up.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Sunita, please.
Yeah, I think, you know, for me, as a leader, you know, for us, we were not all virtual. We had very large physical component and also a virtual component. So as a leader, it was very important how I stood up for what we have to do and what we have to prioritize today. That became crucial, because if I took a step backwards and I took 10 steps backwards and said, no, I'm not going out of my house, I'm not stepping out of my house, it would have been very difficult to motivate the staff to come and work in the spaces that could not be closed, because they are crisis intervention centers and there are people who are in unsafe zones who have to be taken care of this time. So at one end, it was how you role modeled your own leadership with your vulnerabilities, with your sense of anxieties with your team, and still continuing to engage with them at a higher platitude, and saying that we still have to see the larger picture, and we have to take the larger steps. But at the virtual space for my team, because we've never worked virtually at all in our entire lives, since this was the first time, the virtual space became for us the entertainment point. So we had, you know, different kinds of Zoom calls where people actually cooked a recipe and then demonstrated the recipe, recorded the video and posted it on Facebook. And it became such a huge, exciting event in everybody's life, because they've never done anything like that. They've never had a like or a share or anybody saying fantastic on them in a public domain, you know. So doing some very, very creative works, you know, very innovative, creative things, which I could not have thought before this. So we had a whole world of, you know, games being played, cookery shows being done, online content being created, you know, as a mutual learning exercise, because I'm equally technologically challenged person. So, so being that honest with your team and saying, okay, I don't know what is this, and let's now learn together and find together, became such a mutually joyful exercise. It's very interesting, but it just, as I'm speaking it, I'm also reflecting aloud. You know, we as a team have come closer now more than we were 3 months back. You know, now I know more about what my team likes, in terms of what they eat, what they don't eat, what is their favorite food, and what they like to do, and things like that, more now than 3 months back. Meaning, and some of them have worked with me for 15 years, you know. So I think it's
nice.
a beautiful journey of you know, togetherness and bonding that has happened.
Yeah.
You know, if you want to see the good,
okay.
You know,
Yeah,
I can tell
exactly.
you a huge amount of horrible things. But these are
No,
the
that is
fantastic
what we
things.
wanted as well. Sebastian, you're back. Maybe the last question before we have to close, if I may. It was for you regarding volunteering. Are you working with volunteers? Is it becoming more difficult working with volunteers, or is it the contrary? Are more people? Do you have more people that actually help you? I don't know whether how that relates to your work, but that is the question. Sebastian, do you hear me? I think he's frozen somehow. So okay, some problems with the European connection, not with the African connection or the Indian. Okay, is there anybody who wants to add something to volunteers? Otherwise, I would wrap up now. Do you have any specific?
I mean, I can comment very briefly on that. I mean, I think it really depends, country to country, context to context. But my experience looking at it globally is that there's been a huge upsurge in people wanting to volunteer, right? People wanting to help. What can I do? You know, in a moment of crisis, in a moment of a global pandemic, I think most people are moved to help, and they want to help without financial compensation, right? So that the essence of volunteerism, I think, has been very much stimulated by this sense of crisis. Of course, it will look different in different places, right, depending on people's ability, lockdowns and things like that. But I think in general, we've seen a big uptick in people wanting to volunteer. It's just how can they do that?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it goes into this gratitude in action as well, because somehow we all feel a bit like survivors, and you have this, you know, if you come out of that unscarred, you actually want to give something back. So I think this positive, I know it's a lot of negatives as well, but it's worthwhile to share these stories. And I'm happy, Sunita, also for your examples, very nice examples in a society that actually, yeah, is not so, it's not so easy to work remotely and just, you know, use the new technologies. Yes, we're coming to the end, and I thank you very much for answering the questions and sharing your insights. We all know the COVID-19 pandemic is not over. It's not over yet. We don't know how long it will go. I think this is one of the scary things that we all feel. It is unprecedented, so we don't have a blueprint for it. And I think what we wanted as Aurora with this Aurora dialogue today, just to share your experience, and I think I speak from myself, and I'm sure I'm speaking for the team as well, to see you and to hear you, how you just managed to go on and continue despite all this. And I mean, the obstacles are numerous, definitely, that you face. I think this is really, it's heartwarming, it's very inspiring, and I would like to say we are collectively proud of what you're doing and how you're doing it, and that is what we wanted to share with our audience, and that you just go on despite all the obstacles, and you stay with your group and with your target audience, and you try to follow your mission. So on behalf of the Aurora team, and I'm sure on behalf of the audience, I would really like to thank you once more very much for your time and the sharing of your insights and also feelings, or as Comfort said, personal thoughts on this. And I thank, of course, also everyone who listened and watched. And of course, please stay healthy and safe.
These two.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Namaste. Bye.
Take care. Namaste.